When CESA was initially founded in 1987, probably none of the founding members expect Chinese study could be in such size in Australia. But for people who from China or are China study scholars, this is a lot of strange scenario. Many similar things happen. For example, for the education sector is a good example. In 1987, China only enrolled about 620,000 university students a year. But in 2017, this number up to 9 million. Even for postgraduate students, it's already more than what the total higher education intake in 1987. Even in Australia alone, we have 200,000 students in Australia, including James just updated, including 150 higher education students in Australia nowadays. So that's probably the reason we have, yesterday you see the two universities coming to recruit for a full range of positions, from fresh PhD to full professors. Anyway, so if anybody are interested, you should actually catch up them during the break start. Even personally, my education experience also showed a significant difference. In 1987, I was graduate from primary school. In a class of 13, we get 7 advanced to the junior high secondary school. But my class from year 1, we started with 40 more kids. Means that actually most of them dropped over the time, didn't finish the 5 years education. Even with this kind of selective, in 3 years later, when we moved to the senior high school, only 10% was allowed to go there. 90% were forced to drop because of the limited seats in the education level. I think these kind of miracles are, of course, owed to China's successful economic development in the past 40 years. This is actually why we're talking about the topic of this CESA conference. However, this legend economic development is now face unprecedented changes and challenges. In China, I think the higher profile example is how to overcome the middle income traps. It's a significant challenge. And outside China, when you see all this trade dispute now is happening, it's because when China's economies become internationalized, there are a lot of issues come out, including some in Australia. If you look at the environment sector, it's very interesting. 10 years ago, China was more or less considered as a problematic student in the climate change, but now it's widely considered to be a global leaders in climate change battle. I think with this new situation, the Chinese economic study will have to examine both the domestic dimension and the international dimension. We also have to balance economic growth and the environment. We have to also look at the theories as well as the practice. All the challenges and changes are a good topic for scholars like us. As an overseas student scholar association, I think CESA is very pleased to provide such kind of forum for all China study scholars, particularly China economic study scholars, to come to exchange views and insights about the change and the challenges which will impact for the Chinese policymaker as well as the global community. In particular, China's economic development story will probably offer quite a significant amount of lessons for the other less developed countries who are coming to the development stage. So I'm looking forward to see fruitful discussion in the 2 plenary sessions followed this morning, as well as the special report on China's carbon market after lunch, and definitely the 29 concurrent session in the next 2 days. Don't forget that in the last, we have a concluding session open the public about Australia-China relationship tomorrow evening. Tomorrow, I want to also highlight that tomorrow afternoon, we also have the annual General Assembly, we call AGM. This is the highest authority for CESA. We will seek your endorsement for the new council member, the new executive member, as well as the new president. So all the participants here are welcome to participate the CESA AGM. The conference would be impossible without our sponsors. Please allow me on behalf of all the participants to show our sincerest appreciation for our major sponsor, Bank of China, for sponsor CESA 2018. The conference also benefited from the 3 journals who provide support, as well as ANU China Update, provide in-kind, bring many speakers come to here. And lastly, the generous in-kind support from UTS, the CESA 2018 host, is also generally appreciated. Distinguished guests, colleagues, and friends, thank you for your attention. I wish you all a very fruitful conference discussion, as well actually President stay in Sydney. Now, I would like to invite Professor Ian Watt, Deputy Vice Chancellor UTS, for his welcome remarks. Thank you.
Dr. Geoff Raby, former Ambassador to China, Dr. Shi Chunpong, Chair of CESA 2018, Conference Committee, Professor James Laurenceson, Deputy Director of ACRI and a CESA board member, distinguished visiting scholars, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to UTS, to this wonderful business school, the wonderful building, and thank you for joining us this morning here for the CESA 2018 conference and for this great opportunity to hear for some very distinguished speakers on the Australia-China relationship. My name's Ian Watt, and I'm the Deputy Vice-Chancellor International here at UTS. This is my first full working week here in Sydney, and I'm delighted that this event is my first official function in my new role. Before we begin the proceedings, on behalf of all those present, I'd like to acknowledge and pay respect to the traditional owners of the land on which we meet, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. It's upon their ancestral lands that UTS stands. Similarly, I'd also like to pay respect to the elders past and present, acknowledging them as the traditional custodians of knowledge for this place. I'm delighted to welcome distinguished visitors, delegates and guests here today to hear from Dr. Geoff Raby, one of Australia's foremost sinologists and diplomats. The title of Geoff's address is 30 Years of Observing China's Economic Development. Following his address, there'll be a keynote panel discussion on China's 40 years of economic reform and development and some analysis of the current internal and external challenges to China's economic outlook. And the very expert panellists will include Professor Sung-Li Gang, Director of the International and Development Economics in China program at the Crawford School of Public Policy at ANU and a long-time friend of mine, Professor Yao Yang, the Dean of the National School of Development at Peking University, and Professor Zhang Zhongxiang, Dean and Professor of the Ma Ying-Chu School of Economics at Tianjin University. Let me just mention a few things about CESA. The Chinese Economic Society of Australia is a non-profit and non-partisan organisation. It encourages and stimulates constructive inquiries, exchange and discussion on China's economy, growth and development, and disseminates research work related to China's economy and business development. It's become the leading research network of the Chinese economy in the Asia-Pacific region. CESA's annual conference rotates among its member universities in Australia, attracting delegates from around the world. And this year, UTS is especially delighted to be hosting you all here at our exciting new Haymarket campus. China's Australia's largest trading partner and is integral to many sectors, not least higher education. And as such, it's central to Australia's future prosperity. This university has extensive ongoing engagement with China, including some 6,000 full onshore award international students from China and double-digit growth in commencements of Chinese students in each of the last 3 years. We have over 20,000 students from Greater China graduated and an extensive alumni network both in China and in Australia as well as around the world. There are over 5,000 UTS alumni in mainland China and 4,000 in Hong Kong. We have alumni networks in Shanghai, Beijing and Hong Kong run by volunteer alumni leaders. who organise events and social activities and assist in welcoming new graduates. A new South China alumni network has also been launched in Guangzhou. In 1984, the former Sydney Institute of Language and Culture, or SILC, was established as a joint venture between UTS and Shanghai University. It's the longest standing and also the most successful China-Australia joint teaching institution in China. The institute was renamed the Shanghai University UTS SILC Business School in 2014, and its main campus is in Jiading in Shanghai. There are currently more than 4,000 students studying courses through SILC in Shanghai, which has 150 professional staff, including 32 foreign teachers, and 12 of those are from UTS. Between 300 and 400 students were enrolled in UTS programs at SILC this year, and between 2012 and this year, almost 2,000 students who graduated from the SILC program in Shanghai commenced here at UTS in our bachelor program. UTS has also launched a key technology partnership strategy in China in 2010 with the goal of establishing a select number of flagship institution-to-institution partnerships. These partnerships include dual or joint PhD and postgraduate degree programs, cross-institutional teaching, credit transfer between institutions and joint research collaborations, including joint research centres. We have 6 KTPs with Greater China, with Hong Kong Polytech University, Beijing Institute of Technology, Shanghai University, Hangzhou University of Science and Technology, Sun Yat-sen University, and the Southern University of Science and Technology in Shenzhen. And last but by no means least, ACRI, the Australia-China Relations Institute, which was launched in 2014 by Foreign Minister Julie Bishop. ACRI is led by former Premier and Foreign Minister Professor Bob Carr, and since 2014, it's built an excellent reputation through hosting events and forums, undertaking and disseminating research, boardroom briefings, and ongoing collaborations with think tanks and universities in Australia and around the world. ACRI's built up an enviable presence in the Australia-China relations space, and it's honoured to be hosting CESA here today at UTS. Let me now introduce our guest speaker, Dr Geoff Raby. Dr Raby was Australia's ambassador to China from 2007 to 2011, and my boss there for 3.5 years. Following completion of his ambassadorial term after 27 years in the public service, mostly with DFAT, Geoff established Geoff Raby and Associates Limited. He also holds a number of non-executive independent director positions with ASX-listed companies, including Oceana Gold, Yancoal and Isentia. Dr Raby was appointed to the Investment Attraction South Australia Advisory Board on March 29, 2016, and in China he serves as co-chair of Cause Chambers Westgas China Practice. He's head of trade policy at the London-based think tank Policy Exchange. Dr Raby is a member of the non-for-profit Advanced Global Advisory Board, the University of Sydney's China Studies Centre Advisory Board, La Trobe University's Asia Advisory Board, and the Foundation of the National Gallery of Victoria. One wonders when he finds time to write all the things that he does. Would you please join me in welcoming Dr Raby to the podium to give his keynote address? Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. I'm absolutely delighted to be here and to be in this beautiful building. It's the first time I've been here. It's really a credit to everyone who's been involved that we have an institution like this so well represented with this excellent building. You have to bear with me. I've been on the road for a week, and from the moment I got on the plane in Beijing, I've been suffering from a cold. And I'm sure I probably won't get rid of the cold till I get back to Beijing later on this week. So if I start sputtering at various stages, please understand that it's got nothing to do with the event. It's just me. Look, first of all, I should acknowledge, though, Ian, Deputy Vice-Chancellor, congratulate him on his new appointment. As Ian said, we worked together as colleagues in Beijing for a number of years, and I always valued greatly Ian's insights and understanding of the Australia-China education relationship and his incredible networks amongst the education sector in China. And the team from ACRI and CESA for inviting me to be here. So I've been asked to open this conference, which is occurring on the 40th anniversary of the launching of China's reforms in open door policies, policies that have changed China and the world. There was nothing predetermined about this. There was no certainty that they would work or that China would not, as it had done so often before, fracture and implode. The policy risks that Deng Xiaoping took 40 years ago were immense. The political risks were even greater. Yet here we stand today with China utterly transformed economically and socially, but hardly at all politically. China is now a protean force on the world stage, leading in the shaping of a new world order, for better or for worse. I'm sure this conference will have many papers on China's past, present and future economic performance, replete with much excellent analysis. So, with your indulgence, and feeling rather old in this company, I thought I'd give an old person's presentation this morning and talk about how I came to spend the past 34 years of my life, almost the entire journey of China's economic reforms, working on the Chinese economy in one capacity or another, and to share some of my experiences and lessons of a few, I hope, interesting and amusing anecdotes. 34 years ago this month, I received an exceedingly embarrassed telephone call in Melbourne, where I lived, from someone in Canberra. The job that I had been expecting to take in the Office of National Assessments, ONA, as the Indonesia economic analyst was no longer available. They had been unable to wait any longer for my security clearance. The Prime Minister's interest at the time in Indonesia was such that they could delay my appointment no longer. ONA, of course, reports directly to the Australian Prime Minister. I was dumbfounded. I had already resigned from the economics faculty at La Trobe University, where I was senior tutor in economic history. Plans were well underway to move myself and my life to Canberra, a city I had only fleetingly visited on 2 occasions, and one was for the interview with ONA. In the moment, which felt like an age before the voice on the phone could continue, my mind filled with disappointment, disbelief and despair about a new future just having been denied. I readily accepted that I did not know much about Indonesia and its economy, other than having backpacked through there a few years previously and having taken a couple of undergraduate courses on development economics taught by an Indonesian expert, Ken Thomas. But over the months it had taken for my security clearance to come through, I had, between marking essays and exam papers and working on my PhD thesis, been swatting up on Indonesia and studying much as I could about Indonesia. Little did I know then that in the public sector, expertise was something acquired on the job, on the run. Bureaucrats need to be able to jump quickly and adroitly from different tasks and different subjects. What matters then is not so much mastering a subject, but rather mastering first principles. It took a little time for me to learn that. Why those trained in economics often do so well in the public sector is that economics has a toolbox of a few but powerful analytical concepts which can be deployed across a wide range of subject matter to produce sound policy advice. The apologetic voice from Canberra on the other end of the line continued. While I would not be the Indonesian economic analyst, I would be the China economic analyst, a country I knew even less about then and had never visited. Not, of course, many people had visited China in 1984. After profusely thanking the voice on the other end and putting the phone down, utterly perplexed about what to do now, I was in a state of heightened anxiety. I had only weeks before moving to Canberra, I knew almost nothing about China, and I had so little time to read up on it. Thus began what has been 34 years of engagement with, travel in, living in, writing and thinking about China, and advising senior political and corporate figures. By the time I arrived in Canberra early in September 1984, the party had announced that the agricultural reforms of 1978 would be extended to the industrial sector of the economy. In fact, all of the economy would from then on be subject to market-oriented economic reform. Socialism with Chinese characteristics was launched. And so, as I arrived in Canberra in the spring of 1984, one of the greatest economic and social experiments in human history was about to begin. And little did I know at that time, I was to have a privileged position to bear witness to it. The announcement of the extension of the reform and open door policies grabbed the attention of Prime Minister Hawke and his senior economic advisor, Ross Garnaut. Both had been closely following the early phases of reform. Both understood that if the Chinese leadership did what it said it intended to do as far as opening the economy and allowing markets to have greater sway over the allocation of resources, then that would have a profound positive impact on Australia. As is usually the case in economics, the underlying principles were relatively simple. Australia and China would become highly complementary and interdependent economies, were China to begin to integrate its economy into the international economy, and if its economic growth rate would rise accordingly. Hawke's vision of the future Australia-China economic relationship was prescient. Of course, the examples of Australia-Japan, Australia-Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong and Singapore were by that time all well understood. Would then China be the next to join the East Asian flying geese, as the theory of export-led growth was at the time called? But China was somehow different. Almost all sinologists at the time dismissed the notion that China could or would follow the well-established pattern of the newly industrialising economies of East Asia. China was said to have had a recurring pattern of rise and decline, of unity and fragmentation, and that the current period of apparent stability would pass. China's disastrous 20th century was projected indefinitely onto the future by these analysts. Hawke and Garnaut were often ridiculed by the sinologists and Cold War warriors in Canberra. Significantly, one of Australia's leading sinologists had predicted back in 1977 what was starting to unfold at the time I joined ONA. In a series of cables from Beijing, then Ambassador Stephen Fitzgerald set out the potential opportunities for Australia if China began to open to the outside world, as he and his embassy colleagues believed China must if the Communist Party was to remain in control of the country and China was to avoid descending back into the chaos of the previous 10 years of the Cultural Revolution. But like some of the best embassy reports, it was read, filed, and eventually forgotten. After all, at the time, it was the depths of the Cold War, and in the Free West, as in the Communist bloc, ideology so often trumped reasoned analysis. When in 1985, Prime Minister Hawke asked ONA to do an assessment of whether the Soviet Union might follow Chinese-style economic reform under the newly appointed Gorbachev, who was promoting policies of perestroika and glasnost, ONA convened an internal group which concluded that the Soviet Union was only about power, and so market reforms and their potential threat to the Communist Party's control were impossible. ONA advised Prime Minister Hawke that the Soviet Union would not change. 4 years later, it had disappeared. A fairly radical change, one might think. The subtext to this was that despite the things I was writing and saying about China's economic reform, for Cold War warriors in Canberra who, then as now, exercised so much sway over Australia's foreign and security policies, China's so-called economic reforms were more smoke and mirrors than substance. The communist leopard could not and would not change its spots. Senior levels of the organisation also felt deep unease at the Prime Minister's embrace of China and its reforms. Then, like now, senior politicians and their enthusiasms needed to be kept in check by the solid worldly chaps in intelligence and defence. China remained a communist country, and the price of freedom was eternal vigilance. China would not change. The Dutch have a colloquial saying, a cute colloquial saying, "One eye in the land of the blind is king." I knew nothing about the Chinese economy when I arrived in Canberra, but fortunately, no one else did either. In fact, I was probably about the only professionally trained economist in Australia at that time working on the Chinese economy. Being weak in maths, but attracted to the conceptual side of economics, my degree was padded out with subjects such as comparative economic systems, which was a study of the Soviet economic system and Eastern European economies and how they had or might reform. Economic history, which is really like studying long-run growth today, and the history of economic thought and non-neoclassical economics, which exposed me to many different ways of looking at economics, including Marxist economics. It's a wonder that I even got my long-delayed security clearance, as I had, at the tender age of 21, backpacked through some of the communist countries of Eastern Europe to see how they worked, or rather, didn't work. Little known to myself at the time, I had arrived in Canberra with just the right set of analytical tools to follow China on its journey of economic reform and opening. Comparative economic systems helped me understand the early reforms. Economic history helped me to integrate data and search for proxies to make up for gaps and to use theory to patch together coherent analysis from disparate data points. And non-neoclassical economics to understand the Marxist theoretical basis of so much policy discussion in China at that time. Admittedly, in those days in Beijing, the latter was based more on ideology and mindless repetition than it was on sparkling theoretical insights. I often enjoyed baiting officials from the State Planning Commission when they would lapse into repeating slogans about Marxist economics to challenge them to explain to me how the so-called transformation problem, which involves the theoretical problem of transforming embodied labour into value in Volume 2 of Das Kapital, had been solved. Of course, it never had been, despite the waste of generations of good minds in the West, and it remains one of the fundamental flaws in Marxist economics. These and other theoretical debates were, however, very much alive in China at that time. Importantly for me, as it was for Hawke and Garneau, the market was not an ideological construct. Markets and the price mechanism were means of allocating resources efficiently. Simply, the market allocated resources better. Economic growth and the benefits from growth in terms of rising living standards and providing choice and opportunities for people, they were the goals. Deng Xiaoping at the time had made that abundantly clear in two famous aphorisms. It doesn't matter if the cat is black or white, as long as it catches mice, and to get rich is glorious. Similarly, for private ownership of property, ideology dominated rational analysis, especially by the Americans. In China in the 1980s, private ownership of land and capital was unthinkable. Western analysts, almost to a person, therefore said the reforms can't possibly work and will be severely limited in terms of their economic impact. Alternatively, private ownership of property, together with the market, would inevitably lead to the emergence of representative democracy and the Communist Party's ultimate demise. The view became particularly entrenched after the Soviet Union collapsed in 1989. China then, as now, confounded analysts and commentators on these very points. It has extended both markets and the private ownership of property beyond what anyone thought to be possible in the 1980s and 90s, without any move towards representative democracy. Today, the Communist Party is more firmly in control than it has ever been since the late 1950s, and seems to be more broadly supported than at any time since then. My first trip to China was in May 1985. It was an O&A familiarisation tour taking in Beijing, Wuhan, which was at my request because I wanted to see an interior city long before descriptions such as second, third or fourth tier cities had ever been thought of. And of course Shanghai, and I went to Shenzhen on a special assignment. Shenzhen had only a year earlier been designated by Deng Xiaoping as a special economic zone. We in Australia had little idea what an SEZ was, but the Chinese government said it wanted to attract foreign direct investment by relaxing restrictions on investment and providing access to China's vast pool of cheap trained labour. Again, the whole idea was treated with a great deal of scepticism outside of China. To restrict the flood of people into the SEZ, it had been surrounded by a high barbed wire fence. Foreigners entered Shenzhen via Hong Kong and could only enter via Hong Kong after walking across a heavily guarded no man's land surrounded by more barbed wire. We were then met on the Shenzhen side by a particularly shady Australian businessman with whom the Australian consulate in Hong Kong had some tenuous connection. He had been engaged at usurious rates to show me around the fledgling special economic zone. After a long day tramping through construction sites on muddy paddy fields, climbing 4 flights of stairs in the suffocating heat of May because the electricity was rationed off on that particular day, meeting with an Australian stoically trying to set up a cold store logistics business, and driving past a vast, half-constructed amusement park to and from a long and expensive boozy lunch organised by the businessman and his cronies in a not yet completed hotel. With my consulate colleagues having to pay for the lunch, we eventually and happily returned to Hong Kong, relieved, and for me to write my substantive report on Shenzhen. So based on my extensive research of all of one day, in the heat and feeling ripped off by our guide, and having gone to Shenzhen with all the scepticism from Canberra and working from sound first principles, being the earnest economist that I was, and concluding that in Shenzhen, land was relatively cheap and capital was scarce, I therefore advised the government heroically that Shenzhen could not possibly succeed and would become an economic white elephant. Fortunately for me, it did not prove a career-limiting forecast. In December 1985, Ross Garnaut, who was then Australia's ambassador to China, wrote a letter, as one did in those days, inviting me to join the embassy team for 1 year to help establish a professional economic reporting capacity in the embassy. I joined the embassy in March 1986, just before Prime Minister Bob Hawke's extended visit to China. My colleague, the first Secretary Political, was Kevin Rudd. Kevin gave me my Chinese name, which I still use today. As is often the nature of the bureaucracy, 1 year became 2, and then the old exclusive closed shop of the Department of Foreign Affairs was amalgamated with the Department of Trade to make DFAT. And I stayed on in Beijing for nearly 5 years, initially as First Secretary Economic and then as Councillor Economic, running an expanded economic section in the embassy. They were remarkable years for a young economist to be in China. Under the leadership of Party General Secretary Hu Yaobang and Premier Zhao Ziyang, economic reform was debated endlessly. Everything from the extent to which the market will lead the economy, to ownership reform and issues such as labour market reform, bankruptcy of state enterprises and the creation of capital markets, and even early experiments in securities trading. Everything fell well short of the expectations of foreign observers and some of the more reform-minded economists and officials in China, but everything seemed to be possible at the time. No one knew what the limits to reform were or where it would all end up. Everyone agreed China urgently needed to change. The question was how much and how fast. Quite a lot it would seem, and the sooner the better. On one of my many trips to provincial and less visited parts of China, I accompanied an Australian delegation to the capital of Inner Mongolia, Hohhot. On that trip, which was part of a technical assistance project to improve Mongolian pasture and hence the quality of wool that was produced, we visited a woolen textile mill. It was here that I developed the theory of China's value-reducing industry. Value-reducing, not value-adding. The mill was blending relatively high-value Australian merino wool with the local hairy product. The wool was allocated by the then Ministry of Textiles under the State Planning Commission's 5-year plan. It was a vertically integrated manufacturer that took the raw wool through all stages to the final yarn ready for spinning. At the end of the process, the final product was actually worth less than the component of Australian merino wool that was used at the start. This was because under the state-controlled price system, the imported wool supplied to the mill was supplied to the mill at the same price as the local hairy product. For the state planners in Beijing, wool was wool, whether it was fine merino or local rough hair. So the firm had no incentive to use wool efficiently. I came away from that experience convinced that all the debates in Beijing among my colleagues in other embassies about private ownership of property were beside the point. The most important thing that the reforms could do was to let markets set prices. It was also apparent that China had years and years of incremental reform ahead of it, which could generate strong productivity growth by allowing, increasingly over time, prices to allocate resources without taking on the big political challenges such as privatisation. Of course, my colleagues in other Western embassies, especially the US, could not imagine China's economy continuing to grow without private property and democracy. Such was the weight of ideology on their understanding of China's economic future. In August 1987, suddenly the Chinese government announced that it would undertake labour market reform. No one really knew what this meant, but the prospect caused a great deal of excitement. I had the luxury of a job that allowed me to go wherever I wished in China to try to understand what the many policy changes that were being announced actually meant on the ground. On this occasion, I made a long trip from Beijing, some of it by steam train, to what then seemed the far distant northern capital of Liaoning province, Shenyang. At the railway station, at Shenyang railway station, a Second World War Russian tank was mounted high on a plinth to recognise the contribution of the Soviet Union to liberating the region that was then known as Manchu Corps from the Japanese. The tank had survived the rupture in China-Russia relations after 1961. In that part of China, people still felt very grateful to the Soviet Union. I had decided to visit Shenyang, which was an old Soviet heavy industrial rust belt, to see what labour market reform meant in an area hardly touched by the reform policies. My thinking was that if they had even heard of such a thing, that would be something. I called on a huge state-owned steel mill. All the senior managers and the Communist Party secretary happily met me, sat down, we drank tea, and then they lectured me and showed me graphs about the incredible productivity improvements that had come for that factory from labour market reform. So I started with a series of questions. Did the reform mean that the company could sack workers? Oh, certainly not. Did it mean that Shenyang Labour Bureau no longer assigned workers to the company? Of course not. Did it mean the company could set wages, pay incentives and performance bonuses? No. Then what did it mean, and how could it have increased productivity in the company as shown in the charts that have been displayed in front of me? For me, the answer was astonishing and one of my best insights into China, better even than the value-reducing enterprises I had discovered in Inner Mongolia. For their part, the people who were briefing me on labour market reform, they were the ones who were perplexed at my utter incomprehension. They began to explain. While the Shenyang Labour Bureau still allocated workers to the firm and without any consultation on need or requirements, under the new labour market reform, managers of enterprises were now allowed for the first time to allocate labour within the enterprise to different tasks. That is, they could now move workers around between different jobs depending on requirements. For the firm's managers, this was a significant new freedom that resulted in productivity growth. But for the foreign observer, it would hardly register as a reform. On the slow trip by steam train back to Beijing, and thinking how my colleagues at other embassies would respond to my report and anticipating the usual cynical stance to China's real intentions for reform, it occurred to me that this type of reform was likely to be happening in thousands, if not tens and tens of thousands, of state-owned enterprises across the country. Again, if this were the case, China had years and years of incremental reform that could sustain relatively high economic growth rates before ever having to tackle the really tough political aspects of reform. Throughout this period, the political fault lines were clear between the reformers personified by Deng and those who were resisting reform led by Chen Yun. Both were elder revolutionary leaders with enormous political prestige and their own clans, families and networks of supporters. In response to Deng's advocacy of pragmatic market-oriented policies, Chen Yun advocated the so-called Birdcage Theory. The market was the bird, and it was then a question of how big the cage should be. But the bird should never be allowed out of the cage. We read and analysed in minute detail the debates around the birdcage. These were a measure of who was or who was not in the political ascendancy. The most important economic policy document of the year, document number 1, dealt with agriculture. Then there was nothing politically more sensitive than agriculture and China's capacity to feed itself. Chen Yun's fingerprints were all over document 1, which was the product of real political struggle between the reformers and the conservatives. Premier Zhao Ziyang had, along with former senior leader Wang Li, who happened to enjoy playing tennis with Bob Hawke, pioneered market reforms in agriculture. Lucky for them, the results have been spectacular in terms of increasing output and improving rural living standards. Nonetheless, they had a constant battle on their hands with those who favoured central planning over markets. Then the student protest began with the death of Hu Yaobang in April 1989. Over the weeks and months leading to the 4th of June violence, the depth of the political divisions among the top leadership became apparent. As I watched wave after wave of protest groups pass by my apartment on Chang'an and saw a student movement becoming a broadly based movement of people until the military intervened, I kept recalling my Hungarian professor of comparative economics all those years ago at La Trobe University. Laszlo Zsápó was a brilliant economist of the Eastern European tradition, erudite and always thinking in terms of big systems and grand historical processes. He had no time for the Marshallian marginalists who thought in terms of small changes. Economics for him was part of a grand discourse about how societies change. He had been one of the elite group of Hungarian economists that had tried to sneak in market economic reforms under the nose of the increasingly sclerotic Soviet Union. He had been deputy governor of the Hungarian National Bank. He would take cases of cash in the boot of his car across the border to settle Vienna's accounts, Hungary's debts with Western creditors. He had a passport that let him move in and out of the country. But the early market reforms they had been experimenting with had overstepped the mark. Moscow was unhappy, and so having been tipped off that he was about to be arrested, Zsápó escaped with his family to Vienna, but with nothing else. When he lectured on comparative economic systems, he would chain smoke. Yes, we all did smoke in lecture theatres in those days, and pace up and down the lecture hall. He would say to a largely bored and disinterested group of students who would much rather have been down at the pub than listening to that thick Central European accent, that, you fucking Australians, you don't fucking understand that economics is a serious business. As I watched the tanks moved into Tiananmen Square on that fateful evening, Laszlo's words were pounding in my ears. Economics is indeed a serious business. Tiananmen was widely viewed as vindication for the economic reform skeptics, those that had argued that nothing would ever really change in communist China. The Chinese Communist Party leopard had indeed not changed its spots. People like Bob Hawke, Russ Garnaut, and to the extent that anyone would have noticed what I might have said, had been naived and duped, as so many Westerners had over the years. Reform was finished, and China would revert to type. Some form of chaos was inevitable. Some even said we should never have recognised Beijing and should instead have stuck with Taiwan. Taiwan, then, of course, was a far bigger trading partner of Australia than the mainland. By then, the Australian ambassador to Beijing was David Sadlier. David, unlike Ross, was a professional diplomat and had spent his entire career up to that point in the Foreign Ministry. His first posting was Moscow, which equipped him well for China. During Tiananmen and after, he provided outstanding leadership for the embassy, including during the embassy's evacuation, and consistently well-reasoned policy advice to Canberra. Thoroughly professional, he took a cool, pragmatic approach when emotions in Canberra were running high and never lost sight of Australia's long-term interest in the relationship with China. In October 1989, in the darkest days after Tiananmen, when we still had a protester in the embassy that we were protecting and, as a result, had an exceptionally heavy and intrusive military presence outside the embassy, David dropped into my office for one of his regular cigarette breaks. On this occasion, though, he had something he wanted to discuss. He had been invited by the Hong Kong Foreign Correspondents Club to give a speech on China. He very much wanted to do it, but wasn't sure of the angle to take. It was highly sensitive, as the Prime Minister Hawke had been personally deeply moved by the events and the subsequent arrest of his erstwhile friend, Zhao Ziyang. The US was leading the effort to institute a sanctions regime against China, something that Japan was seeking to avoid, while Australia had defined for itself a limited set of measures and no more. In those days, Australian foreign policy was capable of taking a more independent stance from the US when our interests required it than it is today. I suggested to David that he should say that the dreadful events of Tiananmen on 4th of June would have no effect on China's economic reform policies. There would be a hiatus, of course, for a year or two as officials sat on their hands waiting for the country's leadership to resolve their differences and eventually give clear guidance, but China had no choice but to continue with reforms. If the Communist Party wanted to remain in control, then it had to promote economic growth, and that could only be done through the reforms and open-door policies. My reports to Canberra had been saying as much for some time. David agreed, and I wrote the speech. The speech had a big impact. Reports of it appeared in papers around the region and even on the front page of the Bangkok Post. By the time the ambassador returned to Beijing, his colleagues from other Western embassies were demanding an explanation. How could he possibly have said such a thing? The US ambassador was particularly unhappy. To his credit, David invited the ambassadors to a dinner at his residence and included me in such august company to witness the discussion. The essence of the argument against David was that without political freedom, and after Tiananmen, political reform was clearly out of the question, there could be no economic reform. Again, it reinforced for me how ideological preconceptions so often crowd out reasoned analysis, perhaps especially among diplomats. 2 years later, Deng Xiaoping made his historic southern tour to Shenzhen and Guangdong. He reaffirmed the Communist Party's commitment to economic reform and the open-door policies. In many ways, the rest is history. The hiatus of the post-Tiananmen period was now a thing of the past. The country was energised by reaffirmation of commitment to reform. An implicit social contract was struck between the party and society. The party would let people get on with pursuing material well-being and would get out of the detail of people's daily lives, while one-party rule would continue unchallenged. This was all taking place, of course, against the background of another equally historic set of events, the collapse of the Soviet Union. The Chinese Communist Party's leadership was shocked to its foundation by the disappearance of the Soviet Union. The party was determined that it would not suffer the same fate in China. It drew two principal lessons. One, never relax political control, and two, ensure that the economy performs well, even if that involves extending the role of the market and opening the economy further. At this time, a major debate was occurring among both economists and media commentators about how to reform post-communist economies. One side argued for the so-called shock therapy by radically introducing the market and privatisation, notwithstanding the inevitable social disruption that would occur, albeit for a short period, until a new equilibrium was achieved. The other side argued for a gradual, incremental approach, as China was pursuing. The former prevailed in the old Soviet Union and most of the Soviet bloc, with a decade or more of misery to follow, and in some countries, vast theft of former state-owned assets. China's leaders observed this and felt vindicated in their incremental approach. Thus, the fundamental elements of socialism with Chinese characteristics became entrenched, namely, tight party control of politics within a one-party state, pursuit of economic growth, and whatever is required to achieve it consistent with maintaining control, and gradualism, involving small policy steps and evaluating them before proceeding further. Ever since, this has been the policy meta-framework in which the details of specific economic reform have been worked out and implemented. It has led to consistent and predictable policy making, which has supported 3 decades of rapid economic growth and seen the transformation of China's economy and society, while the political system has remained largely unchanged. It has thus defied the sceptics and doubters. The task for this conference, here today, of course, is to work out whether it will continue to do so or not. If the past is any guide, you would have to think that the odds are pretty good. China today, as we all know, is beset by a raft of difficult challenges, both short-term, such as the need to unwind its high levels of domestic indebtedness without crushing economic growth, and longer-term, such as the greying of the population and the secular slowdown in productivity growth. It is now locked into a trade war with the United States, and the developed countries, led by the US, are determined to deny China easy opportunities to catch up in areas of advanced manufacturing processes and artificial intelligence. As the gap between China and the developed rest diminishes, China is and will continue to face a much less accommodating international environment than it enjoyed for the first 40 years of its reforms. In this environment, will its model of political repression and market liberalisation be sustainable? For the doubters, will China's policymakers still be able to defy gravity? Already the signs under Xi Jinping are that some adjustment is occurring, but not in the direction that those outside China would have expected. Xi has been tightening the screw on political control and emphasising more party discipline over enterprises and favouring SOEs and status policies over the market and greater competition. At the same time, Xi Jinping thought socialism with Chinese characteristics for the new era, which has now been inscribed in the party's constitution, seeks to address the rising aspirations of China's now huge and rapidly expanding middle classes for a better quality of life. The new era policies also emphasise moving industry up the value-added chain through adopting advanced technologies accompanied by massive investment in science and technology. The government also sees technology, probably correctly, as becoming a major contributor to strengthening political control within the one-party state by adopting everything from facial recognition technology to harnessing big data to rank citizens' behaviour using another novel Chinese invention, the social credit card. Facing a much less hospitable international environment and with a much more prosperous China domestically, Xi Jinping is adjusting the model of the reform era. As Deng's policies were so prescient 40 years ago, it remains to be seen if Xi's will be in the future. It will therefore be even more important for those studying and analysing the Chinese economy not to rush to judgment simply because what is happening does not fit neatly into preconceived theoretical boxes or because we don't like what we see. Thank you very much.
Thank
you, ladies and gentlemen. My name is James Laurenceson. I'm the Deputy Director of the Australia-China Relations Institute here at UTS. Welcome to the CESA ACRI conference, and a particular thanks to Dr Geoff Raby for his keynote address. When I woke up this morning, the first face I saw was not in fact my wife's, but rather it was Dr Geoff Raby's on the pages of the Australian Financial Review. And the second face I saw was again not my wife's, and it was again Dr Geoff Raby's on the second page of the Australian. You've had a busy day already.
Yep.
Jeff, I thought I will ask Jeff a few questions to start with, and then we've got 20 minutes time, so hopefully after that we can also have some time for questions from the audience, because I'm sure there's a lot of audience interest in asking you questions too. Jeff, in this morning's Australian, you said, as from your speech, if the past is any guide, you would have to think the odds are pretty good. And you were referring to China's economic prospects. What gives you that fundamental sense of optimism? I mean, is it just that in the past China has successfully defied the critics? Or is there something else that you see happening in China, sitting in Beijing, that actually gives you some cause for optimism?
Yeah, I mean, it's a bit of both, James. You can't project the past into the future indefinitely, but certainly what it does show is a tremendous policy-making capacity by the central government and leadership in Beijing, and their capacity to adjust policies as and when is necessary if the facts don't accord with their policy settings. At another level, China is actually a number of economies. There are some now developed country-level economies in China. There are some emerging market-level economies, and there are some developing economies. And I think that gives enormous internal impetus to economic growth. So thinking of China in that way, there's vast waves of the country where catch-up is still a real possibility, and which actually will still be able to absorb older style of development policies, such as big investment in infrastructure and so on. And manufacturing will still play a very big role. But then if you look at the coastal areas of China, which are now at developed country levels of per capita income, they've gone through enormous structural change, and now services are driving economic growth. So I think there is this internal dynamic in China which comes from the scale. And the key is, though, as I think I've been emphasising through my presentation, that they do continue in market-oriented reform. There's no questioning about the market. I think the question is about control. And as I said at the end of my remarks, Xi Jinping clearly is more of a status than his predecessors, and more focusing on control, and there are risks. And so we don't know how it's all going to turn out, but if you look at the past, if you look at the potential for growth in the economy, it's fairly encouraging. Less encouraging is where Xi Jinping takes the politics of all of this. But to my original comment, to respond to your question, policy making has been very adept and adroit over a long period of time, and I don't see that changing.
Okay. Question now on China's international relationships, and in particular its relationship with Australia. You said that during the 1980s, Australia welcomed the reforms because of a simple but powerful consideration. A more prosperous China would be a more stable China, and a more stable China would contribute to greater stability in the East Asia region. That is, it would be good for Australia's security. So it wasn't just an economic boon for Australia, it was good for our security as well. It seems to me, when I read the newspapers these days, the idea that a more prosperous China is going to contribute to a more stable region, well, in fact, it's almost the opposite impression that's often given. What's your take on that? Do we still hold this view in Australia that a more prosperous China is a good thing for our security, not just for our economy? Or do you see some flipping on that?
Very good question. I think we're utterly schizophrenic in Australia. We have absolutely no idea what we think in the high policy level. Because that statement is absolutely true. Would you want a poorer, less coherent China? How many economic refugees does Australia wish to take if China were to implode? There can be no question that a strong, stable, prosperous China is in the interest of the region and very, very much in Australia's interest. What we have not worked out in Canberra is how we deal with a strong, prosperous, stable China of such scale. And it's true, in the 80s and 90s, even the wildest optimists like Hawke, Garnaut, myself, never ever envisaged China like it is today. It was just incomprehensible. So we are dealing with something we hadn't expected, but the fundamental basic principles, I think, are still sound. What Canberra has to do is become less schizophrenic and more creative in the way it manages its relations with China.
Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to invite questions from the audience now. I do have one insistence, though. The first question has to be from a female. The reason for that is academic research actually shows, and I kid you not, this is serious research that shows if the first person who asks a question is a male, all subsequent questions tend to go to males. So I'm keen to break that habit this morning, and I'd like to invite a female to ask the first question. Do we have any? Because I really don't want a stream of questions from men. Any takers? I can see many talented. Thank you very much. Diana Hu from Beijing Foreign Studies University.
Dr. Raby. She's all the way from Beijing to ask you questions. Yeah. My question has something to do with what I heard from Professor Gareth Evans last week at ANU. And he was talking about, he thought the future, the four pillars of Australia's future foreign policy should be more economic independence, more Asia, more international engagement in Latin America. And I'd like to talk a little bit about the economic independence. So we see Australia-China economic relations thriving for the past 10 years at least, in both in terms of trade and investment. How do you see the future of Australia strengthening its economic independence amid its economic relations with China?
Yeah, look, thanks. I'm glad you asked the question because it's an issue that's often out there, and it goes to, I think, the core of what my remarks have been all about. But I know Gareth very well, of course, and have a great respect and regard for him, but Gareth's never been good on economics. And, it's back to my point about fundamental principles. What drives the economic relationship? It's not that we in Australia have chosen to establish a high degree of economic dependence on China. It's basically comparative advantage. And the fact is that there's a lot of Chinese, not many resources per capita, there's not many of us, and we have lots of resources per capita. And we can in Ricardian terms of comparative advantage, mine and export energy, resources and agricultural products at lower opportunity costs than anyone else, basically. So that's sort of the reality of it. And so you say, well, why don't we have greater dependence on India? And everyone's sort of hoping India will become the new China. I mean, for policymakers, that seems to be one of the most circuitous routes out of the policy dilemma they're trying to deal with China. And that is, if only India would replace China, then they wouldn't have to worry about China. We'd have economic independence, and the China problem would largely go away for Canberra policymakers. It's not going to happen. India will be a bigger market, but it's a mix of natural resources. I mean, India's got a lot of iron ore, for example. We'll sell a lot more coal to India than we do presently as it grows. But basically, there's not the same complementarity and fit between the economies. So it's driven basically by the resource endowments and very powerful, one of the great toolbox instruments of economics, comparative advantage. And that's what I said about how when Hawke and Garnaut saw China beginning to reform, they might be brilliant, but it didn't have to be that brilliant because it all happened between Australia and Japan. It happened between Australia and Taiwan. It happened between Australia and Singapore and Hong Kong. What had happened? Well, as those economies with relatively few resources or none began to grow rapidly, we became the major supplier of those commodities. And it's a bit more interesting these days with China, I must say, because education's one of them. But we had a sort of comparative advantage there for a while, less so now. So even in services, you can see how there's just such a natural fit. And the service side of it's growing more rapidly because incomes in China are so much higher. When incomes in China were low, there wasn't a complementarity between Australia and China in services, but now incomes are so much higher, that has emerged as another area of strength. So I don't think there will be much independence. Whilst China is growing, whilst China is a strong economy, there won't be much independence in terms of Australia and China. And there's nothing wrong with that. There really is nothing wrong with that level of dependency. But I'm just smiling because I'm reminded of a very funny comment that the Prime Minister made before he became Prime Minister. He was Minister of Communications. But you may recall that Hillary Clinton breezed through Sydney for all of 12 hours or something in the first stage of her failed presidential campaign. And extraordinarily, she gave a lecture saying Australia shouldn't have all its eggs in one basket. That is, we shouldn't be so economically dependent on China. For some reason, someone in the media asked Turnbull what he thought, and Turnbull, always brilliant, quipped, does that mean America's going to buy more iron ore from Australia? But that is the answer. You know, who's going to buy it if we don't sell it to China, who's going to buy it?
The question of our economic dependence or independence on China is a good one. In fact, if I can just be completely shameless here, this is a topic of the paper I'm presenting later on this afternoon, and I'm going to reference some work done by Nick Groenewald from the University of Western Australia, who looks at that question. When we say we're too dependent on China, what actually does that mean? Does it mean that if there's a big shock in China, our economy goes down the tubes? Well, Nick's done some work on that question. So I think it's important that we unpack what that dependence on China actually means for us.
You might send me a copy of the paper. I'd love to see
Delighted.
it. I can't be around this afternoon, unfortunately. No, but just to say, a bit of a product promotion, I think this is the great contribution ACRI is making, taking some of these assumptions in the public domain and public debate and actually looking what is the factual basis, what sits behind it. And it's really good work, James.
Thank you, that's certainly our aim. Do we have a second question? I'd be delighted to take another question from a female questioner if there is, but I will accept one from a male questioner now if that's all I can get. Anyone at all? Or I've put everyone off.
There's one up the back.
One up the back, sure. Brian, I think that Brian Toohey from the Australian Financial Review.
I'm very puzzled. I can't think of an example in history where one country has said to another, as a matter of our national security, you must not be able to move into a high-tech economy and strengthen your technology expertise in certain areas. If you do, we will regard that as a devastating attack on us in national security terms. I haven't said what they'll do about it, but I can't see what they can do about it or why they should want to do anything about it, other than their own personal economic circumstances.
Geoff, does that concern you where you hear comments that in the US, China is a threat, it is a whole of society threat? Does that concern you that some of that might spill over to Australia?
Yeah, no, very much so, because we seem to we seem to amplify some of those sentiments from the US. Brian, it's good to see you, Brian, after all these years, but Brian makes a very important point. I mean, there are two elements to it. There is no doubt that there's a lot of intellectual property theft going on, and China is very active at trying to target the most advanced areas of manufacturing. That's an issue, but in a sense it's always been an issue with technology, and there are ways to protect yourself and so on. But what is insidious is the way it's been tied up with the point that Brian's making, is that we're going to deny China the right to become a technological competitor. That is taking the strategic competition question to another level. And this is the dilemma we have in our own domestic foreign policy making, is that the US has decided that China is a strategic competitor. It's clearly not a strategic competitor of Australia. We've never been in strategic competition with China. But we are drawn into, ipso facto, treating China as a strategic competitor without any domestic political policy debate about it, because the US has made that decision, which I really think is sort of behind Brian's comment and your question. I think this is something that should concern us greatly, because again, the old simple-minded formula that we used to operate on was the basis anything that was good for China's growth is good for Australia.
on the economic
Yes.
and the security
Yes,
front as well.
yep,
Yeah.
yep.
Another question.
Just on that, there's a historical analogy to all this, of course. What the US is scared that China's going to do to it with advanced manufacturing and so on is precisely what the United States did to Britain at the end of the 19th century.
Just if we could have the microphone down the front. Li Gong Song from the ANU.
Hi, Geoff. Enjoying your talk. At the beginning, you mentioned that China is actually start leading and reshaping the global order, for better or for worse. So I wonder, given that the increasing uncertainties in the global economy, trade war and etc. So what sort of things are required for China actually to make a positive contribution to the global order, basically for better, not for worse? Thanks.
Good. Thanks. That's a problem when you put a throwaway line in a speech. Someone picks up on it. Look, clearly China wants to reshape the international order, and it's doing so. It's doing partly just through its own weight and reshaping direction of trade and investment flows, but it has developed a number of, I think, quite important initiatives. One Belt, One Road, I think there's so much mystique and so on about that, and I don't know why it's viewed with so much fear and loathing in places like Canberra. I think also on One Belt, One Road, I think you'll find Japan becoming much more closely associated with it before long. What I really am quite interested in was the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, which China created. Why I think that is really, really interesting is because it ties in with One Belt, One Road. China can do, if it's only about finding a way of recycling China's foreign exchange reserves and finding a vent for China's massive construction capacity and surplus, China can do that bilaterally. And it is doing it bilaterally. It has been doing it bilaterally long before One Belt, One Road was ever dreamed up. But with the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, China has set out to deliberately tie itself up in a set of multilateral rules and disciplines. They're voluntarily constraining their capacity to act. And if you think about China building a new, or helping shape a new world order, then this must be welcomed. And I think it was such a wasted opportunity and such a failure of policymaking in Canberra that under the pressure of the United States, we initially did not take up the offer to become the first developed member of the AIB. Had we done that, we would have a Deputy Director General of the AIB. That could have been the price. Instead, there's someone from the UK, hardly a big force in the Asia Pacific that has a Deputy Director position. And just on that, the US has a Deputy Director position and they're not a member. That means that the AIB is the only multilateral institution on earth that has a non-member, has non-members working in the organisation. So that's how much China wanted to open the institution, give it standing and credibility as a new piece of international global architecture. And then there are other things. There's the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the BRICS Bank. And so China has been, for quite some time, starting to put in place those foundations. One thing relevant to this, when I first went to Beijing as ambassador at the beginning of 2007, Chinese used to say, foreign ministry people would say to me, where's Australia these days? We used to look to Australia. Australia did things like it created APEC. It led, under Gareth Evans, the Cambodia peace settlement. We led and created with Indonesia the regional process on people smuggling, the so-called Bali process. We're active across the region, but they would say from 2007, where are you? And I said, well, it's a big issue. And they'd say, well, you would do things that we would like to do, but every time we, that's China, would try to do something, others would stop us. We know who the others probably are. And we vacated that space, but wind the clock forward half a decade or so, and China's got the capacity and the confidence to start to do these things for themselves. So I think this is going to be the sort of pattern. I think I need to be clear, though, why I said for better or for worse. What I have in my mind when I say for worse is that we have lived through a unipolar moment led by the the United States, which pursued a global internationalist agenda. That is now finished. And it's, again, something Canberra has to get its mind around. It is over, gone, and we probably will never see anything like that again. So the new order is going to be multipolar, but if you look around the world, the multipolar order, the big actors, many of them, are going to be authoritarian states. China, Russia, Iran, Turkey. Of course, you'll have Indonesia and India, but we in Australia are going to have to work out and how to live in a new order where it's dominated or at least balanced by non-democratic states. And that suggests to me that there's something like a dystopian order that Australia is going to have to work out how to operate in. And so that's what I meant by worse.
On that challenging note, I think we might finish up. I'm keen to keep to time. Thanks very much this morning, Geoff. It's, I guess a lot of people know you as a commentator and a diplomat and a business advisor, but let's not forget that Geoff began his career as an academic, has a PhD in economics. He was a senior tutor at La Trobe University on the faculty there before he was poached to work in the government sector, and I think we've seen that economics training come out in his speech this morning. Many thanks again, Geoff. Thanks
Thanks very much, James, for having me.